So I made a voiceover screencast for my lecture slides that I use in my in-person version of Poli-Sci 2070 International Politics, and that voiceover lasted almost 30 minutes. And that was me going as fast as I possibly could. So I've decided to condense these lecture slides a little bit and try to get to the point. There's going to be fewer details, but hopefully the main points will come across a little bit better. So this is a lecture on the causes of war and peace from the perspective of the different paradigms of international relations. So the key questions for this lecture is going to be: how do liberals, realists, and constructivists understand the causes of war? Why does war happen? And what kind of advice does each perspective give on how to avoid war? Key terms are going to be democratic peace theory and something that I call commercial peace theory, but which amounts to interdependence, balancing behavior and deterrence, and then collective security and arms control. Realism and the causes of war. So for realists, ultimately war exists because there's no power capable of preventing it. In other words, war is a permanent part of the human condition. It's never going to go away, no matter how much we wish that it would. This is for two main reasons. One, starting a war, aggression can be rational for states. It can make sense from a cost-benefit perspective to try and conquer a neighbor. It's risky, but the payoff is often large enough that starting a war could be rational. But also, starting a war can be irrational in the sense that the beginning of war can arise as a result of a mistake and a misperception of the relative power of the different players in the system. And because it's sometimes difficult to see whether players in the system have hard power and how much of it they have, some armies look great on paper but don't fight well. Some armies look weak on paper, but because of the terrain or because of the determination of the fighters, it ends up being a much more difficult war than the aggressor anticipated. And so people can misperceive the costs and benefits of going to war, and as a result they go to war mistakenly. So wars can happen because the players are all too rational, or they can happen because the players are making mistakes. Wars ultimately start, though, not why do they exist, but why do they start? Because of shifts. Something changes, right? War is a change from a state of peace to a state of war, and so that change has to be explained by another change. And for realists, it's a change in the system, a change in the distribution of hard power, or sometimes the anticipation of a change. So it's not that the change has already occurred, but it's in the process of occurring, and we think that it will occur in the future. Rising powers, states whose relative power is increasing in the system, want to assert their interest. They want their power to mean something and to give them benefits. That means extracting concessions from neighbors or former allies. It means perhaps taking some territory. It means perhaps satisfying some ideological goal, some idea of Germany for all Germans or something like that. But the point is that rising powers feel that their power enables them to get more of what they want from other states. On the flip side, declining powers want to keep rising powers in check. Declining powers understand that they are losing relative to their neighbors, and they want to find a way to forestall that decline. A war could be just the thing. You go to war before you're likely to lose that war, or before the other side tries to assert its power. So shifts in the distribution of hard power in the system are a strong motivation or a strong reason or a strong cause for states to go to war. So what's the realist advice? After they diagnose the situation in this way, what can we do about it if you are a state? Well, one, you can never really eliminate war, but you can try to delay it until you are more prepared. How do you do that? Well, there's internal and external balancing. Internal balancing is relying on your own resources. So try to find a way to increase your capacity for warfare. Try to find a way to increase the amount of resources that you have at your disposal, whether that's giving a check to women who have more children, whether that's um, financing technological developments in warfare through your own military industrial complex, or that's buying weapons from abroad, or perhaps simply finding ways to make your economy more productive so that you have more resources that you can tax in the event of a war. All of these things are forms of internal balancing in response to a relative increase in power of another state. External balancing is when you try to find partners who are equally threatened by the rising power of your neighbors. So if you are worried about a shift in relative power, it's not going to be the case that you're alone in worrying about this shift. There's going to be other countries who are also worried about their own declining relative power, and so you can make common cause with them by forming an alliance and a treaty of mutual interest to try and deter. That's the concept of deterrence. Try to deter the other power, the rising power, from attacking and upsetting the status quo. The other strategy, of course, is if you can't balance, then you bandwagon. Bandwagoning is simply a form of submission. It's what the Melians should have done, according to the Athenians in that Melian dialogue, is they should have bandwagon. They should have just submitted to superior Athenian power. And you see this all the time, where weaker countries cozy up to their stronger neighbors and ultimately are willing to let their stronger neighbors dictate certain policies and assert their interests in exchange for not being attacked. It's a kind of protection racket, but it's the best you can do if you are weak. Remember the lessons from the Melian dialogue: the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. And so bandwagoning just might be your best option. Now, bandwagoning doesn't guarantee anything. You might end up being conquered by your neighbors, but it might be your best option nonetheless. Ultimately, for realists, states must be willing to adapt to changes, in particular changes in the polarity of the international system as a whole. If we go from a multipolar system to a bipolar system, you have to will be willing to adapt. People look at the 1956 Suez Crisis, where Great Britain and France paratrooped some paratroopers to the Suez Canal in Egypt to forestall a nationalization by the Egyptian leader. They were behaving as great powers do, which is they intervene in the affairs of weaker powers, but they had ignored the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union had established a bipolar system, and both the superpowers were very unhappy with this move by the French and the British, which threatened to upset diplomacy that the Soviets and the Americans were conducting in parallel with the Egyptians. And so the French and the British miscalculated badly and were forced to withdraw. They didn't exactly lose the war. They were just told in no uncertain terms that their intervention was not welcome, and so they walked away. So that's an example of a changing polarity in the world. Of course, prior to 1945, it wasn't clear that we lived in a bipolar world. The United States and the Soviet Union had not established themselves as the two major superpowers capable of telling everybody else what to do. But after World War II, the British and the French hadn't realized quite that they were ultimately under the sphere of influence of the Americans. If not world polarity, regional shifts in power also needed to be adapted to. So these are more local shifts in power between neighbors might require adaptation, acquiring new allies, perhaps building up your military a little bit more. These are more local shifts in power, not changes in polarity in the whole system, but shifts in regional power. Let's move on to our liberals. Liberals do not deny that wars can be caused by shifts in power. So it's not that they're positing an alternate explanation, but they do see more factors in play. It's more complicated than just rising powers and declining powers. In particular, which factors do they see in play? Well, the first factor they see in play is regime type. Whether you're a democracy or a dictatorship is going to affect the incidence of war. The more democracies in the world, liberals think, the less likely war is going to happen. Why that is a very complicated question, and I suggest you read the suggestions in your book about it. I don't have time to go over it. It's complicated, but suffice to say that democracies might be more cooperative, they might be more trustworthy, they might be less likely, it might be more likely that the governments incur the full costs of going to war, and so as a result, they're less likely to go to war, particularly with other democracies, and that's democratic peace theory. It's not that democracies are less warlike, it's just that they don't go to war with each other, which means the more democracies in the world, the less war happens. A second possible liberal explanation for war is the degree of interdependence. We could call this commercial peace theory so that it sort of aligns symmetrically with democratic peace theory. Countries that do business together don't tend to go to war together. That's not an absolute, of course, but it is a mitigating factor. The more trade ties you have, the more disruptive war is for you, and states are not going to go to war if everybody in their country doesn't want to go to war, because it would disrupt their livelihoods, it would disrupt their patterns of consumption. Certainly if the United States went to war with China, many people in America would be unhappy with that, not least because, of course, the nuclear threat, but also because so much of the U.S. economy is interdependent with the Chinese economy, and the same would be true, of course, in China. A third factor that can predict the presence or absence of war is the presence or absence of international institutions. International institutions are great forums for people discussing their problems, and it's not just a talking shop, but it's also a way to avoid miscalculations by sharing your interests and your concerns with other countries. Oftentimes, particularly in the modern era where we've had international institutions, it's been very clear that a country was unhappy long before they went to war. So even though the international institutions don't always solve the problem, it avoids miscalculation, and it makes people more likely to predict when a country is really going to go to war and they actually mean it, versus when they're just rattling sabers and trying to get you to back down but don't really have any intention of going to war. The point is wars are less likely to be surprises with the presence of international institutions, and if there's a chance that things can be worked out before they get to the point where armed conflict gets underway, well, then that's all to the good. The absence of international institutions means that there's an increase in the chance that war can be a surprise, can be the result of a big miscalculation about what other people actually believe or think, and of course, therefore, make it more likely that something stupid happens. And finally, beliefs and ideology. And we threaten to impinge on the constructivist side of things here, but liberals also particularly ideology place emphasis particularly on ideology. So for instance, there are certain kinds of belief systems that are just more likely to be antagonistic to one another, say communists and capitalists during the Cold War. One of the reasons why Russia and the United States were at odds was not just because they were two superpowers, but because they had radically conflicting ideologies. If they had very similar ideologies, liberals would argue that the risk of war would be much less, and the tensions and the conflict would be much less if the superpowers have the same ideologies and beliefs versus when they have very different ones. And so, of course, we need to pay attention to what the beliefs and ideologies of the other side are, because that is going to dictate how they see their interests, and that's going to dictate how they behave. Okay, so much for liberal causes. What about liberal advice? Well, liberals are going to be more optimistic about the possibilities of containing war than realists. Duh, we know that. Why? Well, liberals will advise that it's possible to build collective security arrangements that work. These are international institutions that focus on peace and security. They can take many forms. Ideally, for liberals, they'd be universal, like the United Nations. We know that the United Nations doesn't completely prevent war, but the incidence of interstate war during the second half of the 21st century has gone down quite a bit compared to what it was before. After all, we haven't had a world war since. Keep our fingers crossed. But collective security arrangements are arrangements whereby states that do commit aggression against anybody within the collective security arrangement get to face the full might of everybody in that arrangement. And if the whole world is a member, then why would you ever attack anybody if everyone else is going to gang up on you as soon as you attack them? So, now, how do they work? Again, that's more complicated. Please look to your book for sort of more details, but think about all the joint exercises that are run and integrated command structures and the way militaries are trying to ultimately work together and cooperate to respond effectively to threats. All of this cooperation, all of this integration of military forces into one another, at least partially for certain purposes, can help explain why collective security arrangements can work. They're better than just treaties where we each decide whether to uphold our treaties. No, there's structures in place that kind of trigger a rule-governed process that will ultimately lead countries to actually follow through on their treaty obligations, their collective security obligations. Beyond that, of course, interdependence is going to be important. Creating lots of trade agreements, either through bilateral agreements or regional agreements to trade with one another, or global international institutions like the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which creates rules for lots of different countries who have joined. I think over 100 countries, maybe more than that, have joined the World Trade Organization, and that sort of sets general rules for trade, making it easier to trade, at least in most goods. And finally, arms control treaties. Arms control treaties are responses to the security dilemma. The security dilemma occurs because when other people arm to defend themselves, that sure looks like they might be getting ready to attack you, which means that you arm yourself, and then they arm themselves, and then you arm yourselves, and suddenly we're in an arms race. Well, arms control treaties aim to prevent that sort of behavior by limiting the types of weapons and the quantities of weapons that countries who are party to the treaty can have. Sounds good in theory, right? Well, in order to make these things work, of course, you need a relatively robust and reliable and credible inspections mechanism. You need, in other words, impartial advisors and impartial inspectors to go make sure that countries are living up to their agreements and not stockpiling weapons on the down low and violating their agreements. Of course, realists think that this is a hopelessly naive project because countries have a very, very strong incentive to seek relative power by violating these agreements. But again, the notion is that if you can create a transparent and reliable inspections process, you can be confident that the other country is not ramping up for war, which means they can be confident that you are not ramping up for war, which means you can spend a lot more money on your healthcare system and on your education system than on your military, and that's good for everyone. Right, so arms control treaties can help make neighboring countries non-threatening. Examples of arms control treaties, of course, include the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, the SALT treaties between the United States and the Soviet Union, limiting the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles. There were arms control treaties prior to World War I that didn't work very well, but the point is that at least if they are well specified, liberals hope that they can contain and decrease the likelihood of war by decreasing everybody's perception of other countries being a threat. Okay, let's get to constructivism. Why do constructivists think that war happens? Well, remember, for the constructivists, wars are always caused not by the situation itself, not by the distribution of hard power, but by the perceptions of the situation, by how people feel and perceive the distribution of power and interests. How are other countries perceived? How are foreigners perceived? As threats, as rivals? Chinese economic growth and British economic growth are not perceived the same way by the United States. Why? Because we have socially constructed the Chinese as more other than the British. Of course, that might not have been true in 1787, but that's another story. That's proof that these things changed. The British were much more of a threat when we had just broken away from the British Empire than China ever was at that time period. So, of course, things change. How different foreigners are perceived changes over time. Not just how foreigners are perceived, but how do we perceive our own interests? How do we understand what matters to us? That's a cultural phenomenon. Like, do we understand ourselves as a warlike nation, as a nation of traders and shopkeepers? Do we understand ourselves as a nation of artists and philosophers? How do we understand our national interests, and therefore what counts as a threat to our national interests? That's going to be something that constructivists focus on when they want to explain whether countries are going to war with one another. How do they understand their own interests, and how therefore do they understand threats to their own interests? Finally, well, maybe not finally, but also constructivists look at the history of interactions between states and how that history is understood by both sides. And finally, constructivists will look at global norms, not just local norms. So they will look at the norms of the state system. Currently, in the current state system, aggression is frowned upon. Countries that attack others without provocation face consequences, retaliation, sanctions. They may themselves be invaded. We can see that when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1989, that provoked a very strong backlash on the part of the international community, because not because Saddam Hussein was upsetting the balance of power in any meaningful way. Kuwait is a tiny country, but because Saddam Hussein was violating important norms of the system. In 1583 or in 1492 or before the Treaty of Westphalia, norms of non-aggression really weren't part of the system. If nobody would really bat an eyebrow if one country or one state went to war with another. That it was understood that these things sometimes happened, and sometimes for the pettiest of reasons. Things like spurned marriage alliances and things like that. So the prevalence of war for constructivists and the international system depends a lot on the norms of that system, right? How much is war accepted? What kinds of warfare are accepted? What kinds of interests are considered legitimate? What kinds of threats are considered threats? And how the identities of the different players play into or relate to the norms of the system. Okay, so what's the constructivist advice about how to avoid war? But like much constructivist advice, it's hard to really act upon, but some kinds of ideas for constructivists appear to be generative of antagonism. They tend to generate more hatred and bad feelings and sentiments of opposition. So racism, classism, xenophobia, religious bigotry, these are all ways of treating the other badly, treating the other as a threat, understanding their interest as being fundamentally and diametrically opposed to our own, whether it's billionaires you hate, or members of a particular race, or members of a particular religion. The point is that you're dividing the world into us and them, and giving people reasons to hate and to dislike and to be suspicious of the them, the other. So these ideas serve to create the perception of conflicting interests based on what one's social identity is. Other ideas, of course, may be much more likely to generate harmony and cooperation, according to constructivists. Norms of non-aggression, norms of tolerance, peace and love, let's all be friends. These kinds of norms can generate more or less conflictual relations between states. And so if those norms are more solidly implanted in the system, we are much less likely to see war break out. So the fight against war for the constructivists is ultimately the fight for the hearts and minds of various decision makers. And interestingly, that's why constructivists are much more likely to see NGOs as being important. It's because NGOs are the ones who are trying to shape the discourse and the norms of the international system, and so they're trying to shape ultimately the environment in which state leaders are interacting, and ultimately trying to shape the ideas that state leaders believe in. In conclusion, my students often like to say things happen for a reason. In international relations, it's much more accurate to say that things happen for many reasons, and these reasons are detailed and emphasized differently by liberals, realists, constructivists. Scholars certainly are going to disagree and continue to disagree about how much emphasis to put on the different explanations just outlined for war, and therefore are going to put different emphasis on the likelihood of different solutions to the problem of warfare. I think there's some progress has been made. I don't want to leave you with the idea that, well, we've got 3 different paradigms and you pick the one you prefer. That's sometimes the feeling that students get out of my classes. This is an introductory class. I think there's been lots of progress made in actually reconciling these different perspectives to one another, understanding when one explanation is more likely to be useful than another, understanding when arms control treaties are more likely to be effective and when they're not, understanding when norms are important and when they're likely to be disregarded. A lot of really high-level work's been done on these things, but it really goes beyond the scope of an introductory courses. So if you're interested in that, please join me or someone else in our department for an advanced course in international relations, and we can try to sort these issues out.